Video I'm going to talk about what is Bitcoin. I know there's a lot of videos out there on what is Bitcoin, but I wanted to make one that just is a simple video, something you can send your mom, your grandma, your friend to get a simple understanding. So I'm not going to get too detailed. There's going to be a lot of stuff I'm going to leave out, but with these pictures here and my conversation here, hopefully it gives someone a simple overview of what Bitcoin is without making it too technical. I'll do my best not to do that. To understand Bitcoin, the first thing I like to do is kind of make it a comparison on fiat money. If you live in America, like the US dollar, if you're in Europe, the euro, um, etc. So, first, let's understand fiat money. Fiat money is a government issued currency that isn't backed by a commodity such as gold. Fiat money gives central banks greater control over the economy because they can control how much money is being printed. So when a government can control how much money is being printed, um, that doesn't give us control on the value of that currency over time. They try to keep the inflation rate around 2%, but as we've seen over COVID, they've had to stimulate the economy, and the Federal Reserve had the control on how much money they printed. And obviously, that affects the depreciation of our dollars over time. So you can have $1 million in um, the American dollar, and you have zero control over if the government doubles the supply of money, in the next 10 years, and so to speak, decreases the value of your US dollars in half by doubling the amount of supply there is, the erosion. So, fiat money, whatever country you live in, if it's America, you use that currency because that's the currency that's controlled by the government. Um, and there's very little control. It's unpredictable. We have no idea what the inflation rate is going to be. We can have our savings in US dollars, like I talked about before, and we have no control or no guidance on what the Federal Reserve will do to increase the supply of that money and increase the value of our currency or decrease it. It's completely up to the country that controls that currency. So, what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a virtual currency designed to act as a money and a form of payment outside the control of any one person, group, or entity, thus removing the need for third party involvement in financial transactions. I'm going to go over that last part in the next slide, but Bitcoin this beginning sentence is not controlled by any one person, group, or entity. So, the Federal Reserve or any other party or company can't come around in a month and say, hey, we need to inflate the money supply to bail out banks or send money to Ukraine or bail out businesses for COVID or whatever. There's a fixed inflation rate in Bitcoin, which we'll talk about over time. So when you're buying a Bitcoin, you know that nobody controls that currency. There's no bad actors involved. It's a specific amount of digital coins out there. Just like there's a certain amount of US dollars out there in existence, there's a certain amount of Bitcoin out there in existence, but nobody controls Bitcoin. So, let's we had the example before. You have $1 million in US dollars. You have no idea what the money supply is going to look like in the next couple of years. With Bitcoin, if you had $1 million in Bitcoin in your savings, although you can't control the price of the coin individually, you know for a fact no one's going to come in and say, hey, we need to inflate the supply away of Bitcoin, thus eroding your savings. There's no third party involvement. Go to the next stage or next slide. So you go into your Chase app or your Venmo or whatever you have. Let's say you're here in America. I know a lot of other countries use different apps. If I want to send money to a friend, it goes from me, it goes to a bank or payment processor, um, gets to the other party. A lot of stuff happens instantly. A lot of stuff takes days to transfer. like stocks or money payments or wires. But every transaction we make today through the current, let's just say, US dollar system that we're in, there's a third party involved. And those third parties, although it being rare, um, could stop you from making those transactions if deemed fit. It doesn't happen a lot, obviously. But technically, your money, you do not have full control or say on if you can send it to somebody else. Obviously, that doesn't happen, like I said, very often, but with typical fiat money, there's a third party that controls the currency, the United States of America, and we've seen them shut other people's bank accounts out, people they didn't agree with, whether they're good or bad, terrorists or not, or different countries. The U.S. can freeze someone out that has dollars because it's a currency that they control. Bitcoin, on the other hand, if I have $100 in Bitcoin or $1 million in Bitcoin, there's nothing stopping me from sending that money to anybody, on the other side of the world within, minutes or within a half an hour. Doesn't need to go through a third party. A lot of wiring to different countries. If you have relatives in different countries, if you want to send money to them, you have to send it via, through a bank. And that process can take days, if not longer, to get to the other party you're sending money to. Bitcoin, not instant, but can get the money there without a third party intermediary, within a half an hour for the most part. So Bitcoin, not only is it not controlled by anybody, nobody controls the currency, but it's also, there's no third party, no censorship resistance. You have full control over who you send the money to without going through a third party. So kind of hit on that point multiple times. We'll move on. Bitcoin mining, I'm not going to get too advanced into this, but obviously it's something you need to understand about Bitcoin. So with the US dollar, imagine the government at the top controlling the supply of money. With Bitcoin, I want you to imagine thousands of computers around the world. And these computers are running the network and keeping the currency going. So imagine a bunch of computers out there using computer power to, without getting too sophisticated, try to solve computations. And all these computers are competing with each other to try to solve an equation. And to try to keep it simple, I know I'm not doing a good job at that. When they solve this equation, they produce the block of transactions for all the network currently being used. So let's say there's thousands of people around the world or millions of people using Bitcoin. These miners are using their computer power to fight, to produce blocks, to be able to execute those transactions. And they get, instead of there being inflation like the US dollar, which is not a fixed amount, Bitcoin miners, when they create these blocks, when they validate the transactions and put them on the network, they get a little bit of a reward, which is the Bitcoin inflation rate. So over time, as transactions are being produced, the Bitcoin network is giving these miners that are verifying these transactions some Bitcoins. And this is the set inflation rate that there is on the Bitcoin network. So certain years, it's a certain percentage. So whatever the inflation rate is for Bitcoin, let's just say it's 20% in a given year. All that inflation rate is 20% more coins circulating to the miners for verifying transactions. So the only inflation there is in a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is the miners getting paid to validate transactions. There's no other inflation, like a third party stepping in and needing to increase the supply for certain agendas. The only inflation there is in the money, in the Bitcoin supply, is what's being paid to these miners to validate networks and create blocks. There's many examples online, but that's why they call Bitcoin a blockchain. Every transaction is recorded with Bitcoin. So as people out there are making transactions, the miners are using their computer power to, solve these calculations. And when they do so, they get to produce the block, which is a record of transactions happen in a given period of time. These transactions get grouped together and stored on the Bitcoin network. So you heard the term ledger. Ledger is like if you own a company, you writing down all your expenses, money in, money out, and you have a ledger over time of all your transactions, amount, from who, to who, date. Bitcoin does the same thing. The miners producing the blocks are creating a digital ledger. Not a paper ledger that can get lost or burns, but this ledger is immutable. You'll hear this. So computers that store a copy of the Bitcoin network, and you can do this yourself by getting a computer and following certain steps. You can look back at every transaction in Bitcoin's history, and it's immutable. So if yesterday at 10 p.m., you and me, I sent $100 to you, nobody can go back in time and erase that from the ledger. That's on there for life. And the reason it's called a blockchain is because we have our blocks here, which are records of transactions. There's a chain of them. So a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is a long chain of blocks, hence a blockchain. So, example, like I said before, you and me send money back and forth. A lot of other people are out there doing this. The miners are using computer power to create these blocks, and this happens, every 10 minutes as time and time goes on, and you can go back over time and see every single block over time, and this happens without fault every day, day in, day out, every 10 minutes. So that's a beautiful thing about Bitcoin. A lot of people think, oh, well, you have no record of who sent who. Well, there is an anonymity on who is sending the transactions, but every transaction can go be backed and looked for transparency, and it's immutable. So here's a little look at kind of like the inflation schedule of Bitcoin. Every 4 years, you have something called the halving event, where the amount of Bitcoin every year being produced by the Bitcoin network to the miners that we talked about. That's the inflation of the Bitcoin network. Every year, these miners are generating blocks, and new Bitcoins are being printed, so to speak, or created as a reward for the miners to use their electricity and their computational power. So every year there's a set amount of inflation, and you can see every 4 years with the halving event, that amount gets cut in half to where eventually at the top of the graph it's zero or close to zero over time. And you can see when Bitcoin started in 2009, the inflation rate was a lot higher for the first 4 years because the amount of blocks being, or the amount of new Bitcoins being minted for the miners were higher. So over time, you can see that decreases. So when you look at like a supply and inflation for Bitcoin with the US dollar, we don't have a chart where we can see with certainty written in code what the inflation rate is going to be for the dollar over the next 10 years. With Bitcoin, it's written in code. Every 4 years, it gets cut in half. And over the entire course of Bitcoin, there can only be 21 million coins. So you can find this online. But when you buy a Bitcoin, obviously you can't, understand what the price is going to be in a certain period of time. But if you have a certain amount of Bitcoin, you have certainty of what the inflation schedule is. And over the entire course of history, with there only being 21 million Bitcoin being produced, let's say you have 1 million Bitcoin, well, then you know that over the whole entirety of the block or the Bitcoin network, you'll have 1/21st of the entire Bitcoin supply. So that's why people like Bitcoin, because with the US dollar, you have no control over the supply. With any currency, you don't, especially if it's controlled by a single party, like we talked about before. That single person or agency, like the Federal Reserve, can change that. And with Bitcoin, it can't be changed. This chart right here is written in code. It's set, and there's consensus among the Bitcoin network that that's what it'll be, over time. And every 4 years, like I said, the amount of Bitcoin being given to the miners via inflation gets cut in half. So the longer you hold Bitcoin, the less and less and less inflation there will be on the current supply. And that's the bull case for it. Like I said, you don't have that with any other fiat currency. I can't look at the US dollar and go, every 4 years, the amount of money that they're going to print is going to get cut in half. You don't see that because it's controlled by one agency or group, like I'm talked about. Bitcoin is controlled by nobody. It's written in the code. Transactions are made. Miners compete for hash power, compete to produce the blocks. They get a reward by doing so. This is a creation of Bitcoin. It's a set amount. Nobody can decide whether it's more or less. It's already written. And then every 4 years, it's cut in half. Just some pros and cons of Bitcoin. A pro is the accessibility and liquidity. I talked about before how you can, just get your Bitcoin wallet and send money to your friend in Brazil, and it could be there within, an hour. You don't have that with any other currency. You see Western Mutual where it takes days or weeks to get somewhere. So the accessibility and liquidity is easier, and you could be in any country, anywhere in the world, as long as you have internet connection and know your Bitcoin wallet password and ID. You can access your currency anywhere you are. So you can travel all around the world with a Bitcoin ledger and be able to send money and receive money anywhere you are. Another pro, there is I struggle with this word, anonymity, but there's transparency. So any transaction that was made can be tracked, and you can go back and it's on that ledger. Independence from a central authority. You could take your money and go anywhere. Obviously in today's society and safe countries, you don't really see the need for a lot of that. But imagine a scenario like in Europe. People say the example of when Jews would flee the country. They would be hiding gold in their teeth or in their bra so that it wouldn't be seized. And a lot of people, leaving tyrannical countries in the past had to leave behind everything they owed. They'd be searched for their gold, or they'd be searched for their cash when leaving their current country. With Bitcoin, technically, in your head, you can know your password and have, your wallet ID written down anywhere, and you can take that anywhere you are across borders. You can even email it. Let's say you have on your email access to your wallet, but then in your head you store your password. Well, you could be anywhere in the world. If you pull up your email and know your password in your head, you can have access to your funds. Potential for high returns. Obviously, speculation. There's a bull case for Bitcoin, but it can also, it's risky. So high return for potential, that's up to the investor. The cons, same thing on that point. High returns, high volatility. A lot of people don't like the volatility. People make the argument, yeah, I have $1 million in US dollars. It can, the money supply can inflate by 10% next year, but I'm only losing 10% of my value. But maybe Bitcoin will have a year where it loses 50%. So I'm better holding my money in cash. And the argument makes sense in that regard, because some people don't like the volatility, and I can understand that. But, a lot of Bitcoin investors think long term. Although the currency can fluctuate up and down, they know for sure what the inflation rate is going to be over a certain period of time. No government regulations. Once again, that just comes back to the point of no third party being able to interfere. No third party can come in. If I'm sending you $10 of Bitcoin from my wallet to your wallet, the government can't step in and block that transaction. Once the transaction has been submitted, there's no way to block it, which is the next point, irreversible. If I send you $100, government can't come in and say, hey, give that $100 back, or I can't go and back that transaction backwards. Once I send you that money out of my wallet to your wallet, it is as good as gone. And on the blockchain ledger, limited use is probably one of the biggest cons of Bitcoin. Some states let you pay taxes in it. I think in Brazil and Rio de Janeiro, they'll let you pay your taxes in it. A lot of people accept Bitcoin, but most stores and markets, or buying anything online, paying your rent, your water bill, your electricity, gas, food, 99% of things you do on a daily basis, you can't just go in and pay with Bitcoin. So obviously the goal of Bitcoin and what a lot of Bitcoin believers want is for there to be more adoption over time, not only amongst people, but amongst, businesses. So obviously the more adoption there is for people accepting Bitcoin, the more reason there'll be for people to have Bitcoin to use that money. So for now, Bitcoin can't really be spent in a lot of places. So most people use it as a store of value, use it to have some money outside the system they're in, where if they go bankrupt or be sued, a third party can't come in and access that funds, or they use it to send money back and forth as a faster way rather than using a Washington Mutual, which takes a huge fee. I'm sorry, not Washington Mutual. I forget the name of the provider which can send funds back and forth, but any third party that charges a high fee and takes a long time to use, that's a bull case. So a lot of people use it for those things. Once again, mostly store value, having some money outside the current financial system. A lot of people use it for if they live in a foreign country like Argentina or South America, where if next year there's a big political unrest, something happens and the government needs to quadruple the money supply, they know that whatever they had in Bitcoin didn't get inflated away 4 times. So do with this information what you like. I tried to make it a simple video. I probably didn't do the best job of that, but just to go over it, digital currency, form of payment outside the control of anybody, removing third-party intermediaries so no one can step in between transactions you send back and forth. Miners compete to produce blocks, which saves the transactions that everyone did on a ledger. They get a little bit of reward, which is the inflation per year, and that's a set amount.